He's assistant professor at the University of Virginia, and he's in psychology, not in mathematics. And I first heard of Fred through the Full Potential Initiative, and that is a longitudinal study of the development and influence of implicit attitudes about intellectual ability, self-concepts, academic achievement, particularly in the science, technology, engineering, and mathematics domain. It's really a fascinating project. They have a website you can all go on and check your implicit beliefs on. And he has worked with one of the participants at this workshop, Irina Mitra, who's also at the University of Virginia, and has used his skills and evaluation processes to help her understand what happened during her, was it a 2-week-long summer program for girls? A 1-week-long summer program for girls. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Fred. Thank you.
Thanks, Kathy. I'm trusting that the sound is adequate. Good, good. Well, it's really quite a pleasure to be here and learn about what you're doing with math circles in an effort to encourage talented math students to engage and reach their full potential, which, as Kathy said, is the public name of our research project. I say public because to the National Science Foundation, it's known as implicit cognition in STEM learning. We thought that the Full Potential Initiative might generate a little more interest and enthusiasm among our various audiences, which include middle school and high school students and parents and teachers. And hopefully, in the not too distant future, math circle students and leaders. And that's something to keep in mind throughout the talk, is that Kathy and my colleague Brian Nosek and I are in discussion about how to dovetail our interests in learning how implicit attitudes and stereotypes develop and influence our engagement in STEM, science, technology, engineering, or math, and evaluating the impact of math circles on those kinds of psychological constructs. We certainly expect that engagement in math circles is, for most students, going to push their math skills ahead. What about their sense of identification with the field and motivation to continue and look at themselves as math-involved people in the future? So we're trying to think about ways to do that kind of measurement. A lot of the data that I'll present from our studies today, I'm going to be presenting a lot of data to you from many researchers, but almost all of the data from our lab was collected online. And that would be available for potential math circle involvement to use as well. And as Kathy said, Irina and I have collaborated in working in assessing the engagement of middle school girls in a math camp. And that's how our collaboration started last summer. And it's continuing right now with her differential equation students. And I'll show you some data today that's hot off the press. Irina has not seen this. She's completely blind to these results. And her students, we've measured them, we're measuring them right now for the 6th time this semester. So as we speak, some of them are probably logged on and doing the site. So no talk in this area is complete without mentioning Lauren Summers. And the quote I'm going to share with you is less notorious, certainly. In fact, it's not notorious at all, and it's not famous at all that I know of. he made this comment 3 months after the notorious comments. And it went like this: any of us who think that we can for ourselves judge whether we are biased or not are probably making a serious mistake. So we all need to think about what we can learn from data about our own unconscious biases and think structurally about what to do about those biases. Well, I should have put a smiling picture of Lawrence Summers on here because this makes me smile. And apparently he engaged in a bit of learning in the several intervening months. Some of that probably from my colleague Mahzarin Banaji, who's at Harvard and a friend of Dr. Summers, and she's one of the collaborators in a lot of the data that I'll show you today. So in our words, Brian Nosek's and mine, when we applied to the NSF a few years ago for the grant that's currently funding the Full Potential Initiative, we said even if most people consciously and honestly believe that interests and achievement should be unconstrained by group membership, unconscious associations may be exacting a toll on the STEM outcomes of stereotyped group members. So the take-home messages I'd like you to have today are that implicit, as we call them, or unconscious mental processes are fundamental to our perception. They are automatic and relatively uncontrollable, especially in the immediate happening term, but not in the longer term. They're related to STEM behavior of many kinds. They can be changed. And mindfulness about them, even though they are unconscious and implicit, matters. In other words, being aware that they are ongoing and can influence us is useful in making adjustments and being aware of the potential impact. So first, let's just get clear on some basic perceptual processes. So starting very simply, I'm sure everybody can see that the two monsters are the same size, right? Apparently there's some twittering there. If we take away the artist's perception drawings, we can see very clearly that they are indeed the same size. And sometimes when I have more time, I'm going to rush through a bit today, I stop the PowerPoint production and take that red bar and move it to show doubting folks that indeed they are the same size and I'm not doing something funny with the projection. But when we put back the perception, I don't know if you're like me, I cannot see them as the same size. My mind is automatically, it is so used to processing lines converging in the distance in our environment and inferring distance from that, that I can't turn it off even when I know it's false. Here's another example. I'd like to engage you in a little task here. So with me, we're going to count, we're going to run down and just say the colors of the ink of these letters as fast as we can as a group, all right? So ready? Green, blue, red. Keep going. Okay. Pretty straightforward, right? Simple. Let's do it again. All right. Same thing, just the color of the ink. Okay? Ready? Go as fast as you can. Green, blue. Wow, you were faster than my pointer. That's impressive. All right, one more time. Just the color of the ink. Okay? All right, here we go. Ready? Blue. I'm sorry, I lost the button on my pointer there. That must have thrown you off. Well, what's the problem? Anyone? Or cognitive dissonance? Of a sort. The problem is you read and you can't help it. You cannot stop yourself from reading that word, and it's interfering with your other task of processing the color, which is now different. Children who are not automatic readers yet have no problem with this task. They don't have that interference. Okay, I'm sorry that I'm imposing a history test on this group, but let's give it a shot. Can you name this famous figure without turning your head upside down? Anybody? Margaret Thatcher, right. Yeah. Let me just flip it over to make it easier for you to see her.
Yeah, that's Margaret Thatcher, right?
Yeah. That's the exact same image, but we didn't have any problem integrating that when it was upside down because the mouth and the eyes are oriented properly to what we are used to processing, and we're very good at processing those features of the face. We can't do it the other way around too well. We can't just integrate them when they're upside down. Okay, here's another surely problem. Surely you can see that the shades of gray in this square and this square are the same. Right? This is again one of those instances where we are so used to taking cues in the environment like edges. Edges are very important to us, and contrasts in colors. So because of the different colors on either side here, it makes this look very dark, and the darker ones here make this look very light. Let me just click, and the next slide links these two, and now you can see that they really are the same. And I will stop this. It's just because this is so cool. And take this and just slide it over here into the beautiful white area. And you can see that that's all one color. Now it looks even darker because it's surrounded by light. And these look, but if we slide this back over, presto, they're the same. But we can't undo it. We can't see them as being the same. We can't adjust for our automatic perceptual processing, which, on that note, I'll say it usually serves us, that automatic processing, very well, very effectively. But sometimes it can give us the wrong answer. So how does it start to factor into social perception? This study gave half of the participants a warm cup of coffee and half participants an iced coffee. And it turns out that people who held for a brief time the warm coffee later rated a target person as more warm and were also more generous in a task where they could decide how much of something to give away. Turns out there's evidence that the same region of the brain is involved in physical warmth and social warmth judgments. How about romance and high scary places? This goes back a few decades. And it turns out these researchers varied whether they had an experimenter approach a participant at a high, scary, rickety bridge or a low bridge in the same area. And it turns out that when the experimenter was a woman and the participant was a man, the man or the men in the study were more likely to generate sexual images in a thematic apperception test. They were also more likely to try to contact the experimenter after the after the experimental session. And that neither of those effects happened when the experimenter was a man. So there's something about the arousal of that higher bridge that was being misattributed, apparently, to interesting sexual romantic ideas and behaviors. Now these men who were making more contact, this was a between subjects design, they didn't know that this experience was causing them to be more amorous. It took the experiment to tease that out. Here's another classic study. Participants were brought into a lab and shown a video of this baby who at first was very happily playing with a jack-in-the-box. Dun, 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 dun. And then Jack pops out and the baby starts crying. And the participants were asked to judge or to say, what is the baby feeling? With one exception, half the subjects were asked what Debbie or some other girl's name is feeling, and they were more likely to say, well, she's afraid, she's been scared. If they were asked what Danny's feeling, they're more likely to say he's angry. Same video. So the frame of social stereotypes that they brought to this incident influenced how they perceived the baby's reaction. Now we can all, this is where I think Lawrence Summers most missed the boat in giving short shrift to the cultural and environmental influence. He's probably right that there's been a sea change in overt discrimination, and maybe that's what he was referring to. But in terms of the fabric of our daily involvement from birth through life, or as Elizabeth Spelke would say, through tenure, is replete with ongoing messages that we may not be aware of. So, Nozick, Banaji, and Greenwald said, we can suggest that a fundamental categorization at birth into the groups male or female produces identification with one social group, and that such identification shapes and is shaped by experiences that are expected of that social group. Identification is going to figure prominently in a lot of the research I'll share with you. So here's a study in a sequence of studies we've been doing in our lab for the last year or so. And this is just one example. So these are participants who are coming to our site, our demonstration site on the web. I'll show you that a little bit later. And in this case, we looked at just those who self-identified as teachers. And you can see we have a fair amount of traffic. This was probably over a period of several months, 4 months or so, and we had these numbers of teachers. And we presented them with a case study, a couple of paragraphs about a hypothetical rising middle school student who was recommended by the school to jump ahead in math. A whole grade to the highest, instead of being in 6th grade honors, to jump to the 7th grade honors algebra 1 class. And we threw in there some, and the student and parents were excited about this, but the parents had some question marks, some concerns, wondered if there were academic trade-offs or costs, leaving some gaps maybe. They wondered if there were any social costs. The student was going to have to miss lunch with his or her 6th grade peers, and that was the big social time. Anyway, so we muddied it up with some concerns. And then we asked the teachers to rate or to make a recommendation to the parents. Move ahead or stay in the 6th grade honors. And it turns out the female teachers showed a slight bias to pushing ahead the the girls. When again, the name, we randomly varied the gender of the student with the name of the student. And you can see this rate is low here. So these concerns we raised, and we also raised some concerns from the teacher about that by way of illustrating the possibility of gaps. The 5th grade teacher said, well, yeah, that's great, but boy, I haven't covered some stuff that the student's going to miss. And we think that probably really depressed these teachers' willingness to put forward. If a colleague is saying they've got some concerns. In any case, we saw this slight pattern, and for the men, we saw a stronger in-group bias, such that they held the girls back more and put the boys forward more. So, stereotypes affect math performance. I'm sure many of you have heard about the phenomenon of stereotype threat. The basic idea is that if gender or some other group attribute that is stereotyped in an area is made salient, in this case in women's mind, concern about fulfilling that stereotype, if they are women who care about the domain, if they care about doing well, if they don't care about it, then they're not going to be worried by having their gender made salient. But if they care about it, theoretically, that can inhibit their performance on math tasks of various sorts. I won't take time to get into some of the mechanisms being studied that seem to account for that effect. But maybe with time, with questions, we can talk more. So again, identity here is critical. And this group of researchers, Margaret Shih and colleagues, did a very elegant experiment with Asian women. They either primed their female identity in a very unobtrusive way. They filled out a questionnaire having to do with dorm preferences. Do you prefer single-sex or co-ed dorms? And things of that sort. Or they primed their Asian identity by asking them questions about their lineage and generations in the United States and things of that sort. And it turns out that priming the female identity depressed their performance on a difficult math test, and the Asian identity boosted it. Nature-nurture beliefs affect math performance in a very similar fashion. Dar Nimrod and Hein, and again, a very clever experiment, had women basically do some GRE testing. First they did a math section, then they had a verbal section, and then they did another math section. The verbal section was an essay dealing either with a genetic argument about gender differences in math or environmental arguments about the difference. And the results were the same as the stereotype threat one results that you saw from Shih. When, if we will, the Larry Summers leading hypothesis about natural existing gender differences, sort of immutable, fixed causes are primed, the women's performance suffered. And when environmental causes were proffered, the performance was boosted. This is very relevant to some of the discussion this morning during Janet's talk. The gender ratio in the room can influence performance. When women are the minority among men, the performance, and again, they did this in the lab, and I'll tell you briefly, they had groups of 3. And women were either with all women in the group of 3, or initially in their first study with 2 men. And that's where they showed first that the performance suffered and in the single-sex environment was improved. They followed up and had 2 women and 1 man. And that rendered an intermediate level of performance. So it was very sensitive to the ratio, the decline in performance, but it was a significant decline nonetheless, when there was any gender mixing in the room out of just 3. Now this is, Irina, this is the first result you're going to see from your differential equation students in a stereotype threat experiment this semester. So there are about 86 or so students in her 2 sections of differential equations. And in one of our sessions with them, which are take generally about 10 to 15 minutes online, they can do it whenever they want. We gave them this often used mental rotation task. And this kind of 3-dimensional rotation is consistently showing the largest gender differeces of all cognitive tests, often approaching a standard deviation. And by the way, there's lots of research that demonstrates that that gap can be diminished through experience and training and playing computer games. So anyway, you guys have already figured out that the correct answers here. There are 2 for every set, and students see 24 of these problems, and we gave them 5 minutes to get as many as they could, and there are 2 right in every group of 4 that match when they've been rotated, the one on the left. Before I show you, this is not our results, this is published work, and this is using the same task, although I think they gave these people more time than our 5 minutes. But at any rate, a typical kind of stereotype threat effect where the men performed much better than the women. And I guess to see the effect, I have to show you the others. Again, they've used this same unobtrusive priming of gender identity that the she group used. They also, for another group, primed their private college student identity in a similar way, or their Northeasterner identity. And those identities didn't have any effect on the men and women performance. It was priming gender, which is stereotyped in math. Northeasterners and private college students are not stereotyped differentially in math for the men and women. Does that make sense? This is a really fascinating recent finding. Again, using the same mental rotation task as the dependent variable. So in their priming of gender stereotypes, they had these students, these were German students in mixed gender groups. Imagine being about to meet a person you've never met and estimate the probability that the person is male or female based on various facts about them. And they read 16 facts that all have to do with cognitive abilities of different types, which later they were tested on. And they rated the probability. So that was the prime for the treatment, the threat condition. The controls said estimate the probability that the person is North American or European. Okay, so they're in very, very nice experimental control. They were all reading the same list of 16 cognitive tasks, but making a different judgment about how that influences identity, and so thus making salient these stereotypes or not. And on mental rotation, they found, and let me help you parse this, and I have to parse it myself. The solid line here are the men, and these are the women. This is the threat condition, and this is the control condition. So no difference when they were judging Europeans or North Americans, and a big difference when judging the gender. It did not significantly affect the women, as you can see these overlapping errors, but did significantly boost the men. So the men were in that, what was a threatening, in the direction of a threatening prime for the women, were charged by that to do better on the mental rotation task. And they also tested a two-dimensional rotation task and did not get the same, certainly not the same magnitude. Everyone, women and men, were boosted in the threat condition, but they actually went, the men slightly more. Now they're significantly better than they were here in the controls. I'm talking like it was a within subjects, but it's two different groups here. For verbal fluency, you can see no effect for the women. They show the standard effect of outperforming the men on these verbal tasks. But here too, the men are invigorated, if you will, by the threat, by making gender relevant. Even though this isn't a stereotyped domain for them, their performance was in the direction of being boosted. And this is perceptual fluency, and nothing going on there. The most interesting thing then about this study is that they took testosterone assays immediately after they did the mental rotation task. And it turns out that there was no effect on the testosterone level for the women and a really big effect in the threat condition for the men. The men with their gender salient had a spike in testosterone that mediated a portion of their performance, explained statistically their performance on the mental rotation task. So I wanted to share that with you before showing you what we found with the differential equation students. These were just college students, not particularly math-oriented. And in the first one I showed you, the McGlone and Aronson, those were probably psychology students. They were not math or physics majors, they said. So here's differential equation students. Our manipulation was a bit more direct, mainly because we were afraid that since we were exerting no experimental control over the actual testing, they weren't in a lab, they were doing this wherever they wanted to at their own laptop in their dorm room with people over their shoulder. So we were kind of heavy-handed with the threat. So the controls saw this is the visual spatialization task, and the threat people saw this is the spatial intelligence test. And the controls heard positive things about exercising their brain, and research shows this builds new brain connections. And the threatened people said high scores have been shown to relate to achievement in high-level math and science. So we're really bringing this into their domain, their apparent comfort level. We're trying to learn how people get better at it and how this may relate to getting better at differential equations. We're examining whether the typical finding of a male advantage applies for differential equation students and whether the skill is specifically related to learning in differential equations. All of these things are true, by the way. We haven't used any deception here. Please do your best. It turns out the women were not affected by the manipulation in the differential equations course that Irina is teaching. By the way, these scores here, I've adjusted these for guessing, just because by random, if you randomly guess on all 24, you'll get 4 correct. So I've just deducted that proportion from each question. So that's why these are a little lower than they would be. The men, just like in the other experiments we've seen, were boosted in the threat condition. And this is a significant finding. And these numbers are very small. This was the session where a lot of it, we cut it off early, and so we even lost some. As it was, we have 86. There are probably 70 students spread across these 4 conditions. And you should know, too, that it's essentially a 50-50 gender mix in Irina's courses. Slightly more women, actually. So how do we try to directly measure implicit associations? I'm going to show you the most frequently used technique, but it's just one of many. And it's the one that we've been using in most of our web studies, called the IAT. So a couple of years ago, the Colts and the Bears were in the Super Bowl. So some of you may know that the Bears are Chicago and the Colts are Indianapolis, not too far away from one another. And so we asked people to sort Colts and Bears images into their correct pile. So sort a Bears image onto the right and a Colts image to the left. And then good and bad words, or no, in this case, expressions. So good goes to the left, doing this with a keystroke, a right or left key. And bad goes to the right. And now we combine them, but the same task, just if you see a Bears symbol, you send it right, And a good face, you send it left. And then we switch them up randomly. Everybody, this is a within subjects experiment. And we randomize whether they get one condition first or the other, and we give them some practice switching. And now, so that's the paradigm. And we've been doing this on the web for quite a few years. So grandpa, for example, would go to the left, and literature, in this case, would go to the right. So now it's your turn. But let me put one question to you. Do you want to start with what we would call the stereotype congruent pairing, where you're going to have to sort men and science and women and liberal arts with the same keys? Or do you want to start with the counter stereotype pairing? Anybody care? Pardon?
Whatever raises our testosterone.
Okay. It doesn't matter, apparently. All right. Well, let's start with it doesn't matter in terms of the results here, but let's start with the counter stereotypic pairing. Oh, here we go. Oops. Okay, so this is it's very important to be assertive in this exercise. So I need to hear everyone's voice. And here's what you're going to do. If you see a female word, I want you to say left. A male word, say right. And I'm going to just hit the space bar when you say it. You need to just kind of do it together, okay? Ready? Right.
Left. Left. Right. Right. Left. Left. Right. Left. Right. Left. Right.
Okay. Your average, median response time, 1,003 milliseconds. So about a second. Somebody please take note of that. All right. Now let's practice science and humanities. Ready? Science left, humanities right.
Right. Left. Right. Left. Right. Left. Right. Left. Left. Right. Left. Right.
Okay. 9:26. Okay. Nothing's changed. Okay. Same thing. Science or female left. This is what you've trained for. Okay. Humanities or male right. Ready? I'm going to look at you. I'm not going to look at the words to bias my spacing. Ready? Okay, 9:42. All right, little retraining. Ready?
Left. Right. Left. Right. Right. Left. Right. Left. Left. Right. Left.
Okay. Last block. Ready?
Left. Right.
9:15. What was the counter-stereotypical time? Pardon?
9:42.
9:42 to 9:15. That's about as small as I ever see. So we're talking about a 30 point, roughly, not quite. You math? Anybody good in math? That's actually, I think that is the smallest effect. So the stereotypical pairing was a little bit easier for you. Even though, so people will want to argue one way or the other, well, we learned the other way, all right? And then that interfered with my performance. But even though, you were faster on this second one, even though you would ordinarily get some interference from the first learning pattern. Make sense? Typically, yes?
How do we know it's
About myself, mine? That's preposterous. No, that's a good question.
But that's not how it's normally done, right? This is normally
Oh
done
no.
individually.
Oh yes, yeah.
Got it.
This is just for fun, and it always works, and it works regardless of the order, and it works whether I'm looking or not. But yet that doesn't rule out your, you have a good experimental mindset that's a possible explanation. Yeah. Yes. Always, in fact, they're almost always larger. In fact, they're,
Because what I noticed is that every now and then I'd sort of stall for a second, knowing that I was slower, but somebody in the audience would pick it up for me.
right,
And so
right.
I'm sure that.
This is very crude.
Right.
It's just a simulation of the technique, and it's done by individuals. Yes.
Have you done it in Chinese?
In what?
Chinese or
Yes.
and it's same.
I'll share with you in a little bit, in a way, some results. Not very specifically to your question, but sort of. But we should probably go on. Let's see. Okay, so this is a screenshot of our demonstration site that's been running since launched in 1998. You can go choose at the demonstration site up to about a dozen or so different tests of this sort on all kinds of topics. And for almost a decade now, the test that you just took has been one of the options you could pick here. And these flags are now all the sites, the international foreign language sites that we have this operating as well. And this is now kind of a bit, I don't know, this was a few years ago that we made this plot, but it's unchanged. You can see this is thousands, this is up to 30,000 here, number of participants. And the darker blue bars show the participants that scored in the stereotype congruent direction. It was easier to connect men with science and women with humanities than the other way around. About 70% evidence that pattern. These people here, these are not significantly different from zero or no differential ease across condition, and only 10% show the counter-stereotypical pattern. Now, over 500,000 people have taken this test online. And when we look at the aggregate, we see no difference between men and women in experiencing this phenomenon until you look at math circle leaders. And people like them who identify with science. For women who identify themselves as a science major, they have dramatically lower bias. They're not flipping over to the other side. Over here would be, again, the counter-stereotypical direction. But they are dramatically different from women who were not science majors. And the opposite pattern holds for the men. Men who are in science have the highest bias of any men, and the reverse is true for women. And what we're trying to figure out in our research is the chicken and egg problem here. You know, what's causing what? And we really think it's a recursive loop, bidirectional processes. Let me break this down a little further for you. Here, these are the major options that people have on the website, which I think are imperfect groupings, but you'll get the idea. So there are 12 different options here, and I have ordered them based on some psychology graduate students at the University of Washington were asked to rate the science-ness, the science content of these groupings. So you can see, oh, there's the pattern for women. I didn't mean to press. So women at our website, this represents about 80,000 women who self-identified in these majors. So there's the pattern. All the science-rated subject matters are over here, and that's where the lowest bias is for the women. So by far, those who identified as biology, life science, or engineering, math, and physical sciences show the lowest bias by a huge degree. And for the men, it's the opposite. Now think about what's going on here. So these women, every day, they look in the mirror and they know that they were a humanities major or a visual arts major, and I'm a woman. And so that's the fabric of their existence. They're getting that, those associations. And that's what we think we're trying to test with this task, indirectly gauging the strength of cognitive associations between concepts, self-concepts, attitude objects, domains, and so on. The effect sizes here are large, the largest when you're out in these more stereotyped areas. The biggest ones are in the sciences. This is the effect size, so the mean difference scaled by the standard deviation again here, 0.8 for both of these areas between men and women. So, and in these more domains where there aren't the strong stereotypes, we see the convergence and the crossover. This follows up, I think, nicely with Janet's presentation about the international connections. We looked at the TIMSS data, which she cited briefly, the international test, and looked at the 8th graders' performance in science and in math, and found a strong relationship between the gender gap. So when men exceed, when the boys score, this is the points between boys and girls on the science exam. And you can see in most of the countries, the boys are achieving at a somewhat higher level than the girls. And the plots here are the means for people coming to our site from these countries who report a citizen of that country. And the median sample size for our people here is like 470, with a big range. The United States, it's like 280,000. And for Moldova, it was 15. There are 34 countries here, all 34 that the TIMSS has comparable data on. Tunisia was an outlier when we ran regression diagnostics. The correlation drops to 0.56 when you remove Tunisia. Similar pattern for the math achievement. Although math on the TIMSS, there's the boys don't exceed the girls systematically on the math. So environment seems to be related to implicit bias. Brian Nosek and Mazrin Banaji did an experiment in the lab with a different kind of implicit association test, but similar. And this one, math attitude. So it was math, humanities, good, bad. And this is kind of a standard finding with just an average sample of college students, the women are more pro-language, and the men here are slightly, significantly more pro-language, but closer to even. That's when the experimenter was male. When the experimenter was female, dramatic shift in this unconscious process for the women, but not for the men. So the women nearly flipped to a significantly pro-math implicit bias, just by the presence of an ostensibly competent female leader running them through their paces in the lab. Here's a study of women in college calculus, a semester of college calculus measured at the outset on their implicit stereotype like you did, only with math. And if they had weaker implicit math bias to start, this predicted stronger calculus performance at the end. If a measure of their gender centrality was low, asking how important is your gender to your sense of self. Again, I've noted that identity matters a lot in these, the formation of these associations, apparently. So, for example, being a woman is an important part of my self-image. So those that answered low to that and had weaker bias did better on their calculus. And here's a plot taken from the article. So these are the high gender identification women, and this is low or high implicit bias. So those low in gender identification, they're not different here when they have high bias, but if there's low bias combined with the low identification, they scored better on their calculus exam. Now we're back to arena students. And this is basically what you just took, only with math instead of science. And we see a very similar result to what I showed you in the plot, where these are very strongly identifying or very high achieving math students, 300 level math students at UVA. And we see a very low bias in this box plot for the women and very high for the men. It's what we've come to expect now. And I'll throw in here, these are another group of UVA women measured the year before who were volunteers in a Big Sister program, so not self-selected on mathematics. And we see that their bias splits the difference here. These are all significant differences. They move more in the traditional direction of the bias for non-science women. But probably some of these women are science and math as well. And finally, this is a group of middle school and high school students at a school in Chicago that we've been studying. These students, 70% black, 70% subsidized lunch at a charter school for girls that emphasizes math and science, not a magnet school. That's just their emphasis. And we see this remarkable, nearly non-zero effect for these girls. So we're very keen to understand the developmental course of these implicit biases, what environments have an effect, how early and how stable they are. Here's more data from our big Project Implicit website broken out by age. And so this is some cross-sectional suggestion that there may be a developmental effect toward more bias as people age, but we need longitudinal data to look at that. Again, if we put those Chicago girls there, their mean is way down here. So these are 276 kids that are under the age of 13. Their average is up here, and so on, 13-year-olds. So these are very different performing. So how do we undo implicit biases that we don't want to have? Quickly, it seems that you have to redo them. You can't just undo them. Just saying, no, I don't want to have them, doesn't seem to do the trick. You have to actually build new associations. You have to do that by exposure. So the more you can surround yourself, expose yourself to counter stereotypical associations in your environment, the more likely you are to affect your own implicit biases. We're wired to develop these associations, but our explicit attitudes matter because, again, we can make choices to do different things in our environment to diminish the stereotypes that we see. And I think this is very relevant to how things are structured in math circles, potentially. The education allows us to do self-monitoring of what's going on. And very importantly, I think, generally, adopting and teaching a malleability mindset about ability. Again, in the other direction of the nature idea. Certainly there are some biological underpinnings of some of the differences, and we see, the effects of testosterone and so on. But those are there. We also know that there are tremendous cultural and environmental influences that we can do something about. So we should think about how can we maximize the open doors for everybody. And we see that people are moved wherever they are. It's not static. So malleability mindset, conscious structuring of the personal and organizational environments. Years ago when orchestras started to use blind auditions, the proportion of women making it through the rounds jumped dramatically. And this was long after women had been overtly accepted into orchestras and the audition process. Apparently implicit biases were acting, associating extraordinary musical talent with maleness. So putting up a structural screen in that case, even the playing field. Hands-on and positive emotional experiences seem to be implicated in the formation of implicit associations. So math circles, and I know you're doing this, making it fun, making it engaging, making it social, is going to increase that sense of I belong here, I like being here, I'm a math person. So the take home again, the implicit mental processes are fundamental. They're automatic, relatively uncontrollable. They relate to the things we care about, STEM behavior. They can be changed, and mindfulness matters. Thank you.